and welcome back to Best Love Films, the podcast that goes with bestlovefilms.com. Let's begin by acknowledging that this land, the US of A, was stewarded beautifully by hundreds of generations of Native Americans before any white people showed up. We are thankful. We also want to try to do better than some people about it. My name's Daniel Smith Rousey. I don't know that I say that every podcast, but I think I have been telling you that I'm sitting here with Mr. Kieron Edwards. Kieron, how are you?
I'm doing well. This is a very interesting sort of last four films to run out the 50s that we're talking about
It
today. So
is, isn't it? Yeah,
it'll
because
yeah.
I guess one tiny theme is the emergence of Vincent Price as a mode of horror of his own.
Yes.
That's something. And
Yeah,
I'm
the
very,
ascension of
oh, go ahead.
his career basically because of that. Yeah.
Yeah, it almost feels like he did a pivot at some point here, and then there was no going back. There was like no, no, you don't cast him as like a romantic, you don't cast him in the roles like Gene Kelly was getting at this time after this, like romantic, whatever, you know?
He was doing a little bit of that when he was younger and he first
Well,
started out,
right.
and
And
then
yeah,
things changed. He also went back and forth a lot between here and theater as well too,
sure,
which
sure.
was for the better and for the ill, but it kept him busy, which is what he always wanted to be. So
And thank God that he wanted to be that. I'm sure
exactly.
Roger Corman is happy that he was willing to be that, among
Right.
other people. But yeah, there's so much to. That's a person who really understood what he was and didn't necessarily try to. There's other Hollywood people. One person who leaps to mind is like Jimmy Cagney, who are always like saying, "Why do you keep casting me in these same roles? I hate it.
Right.
I want to break out from this." Meg Ryan didn't want to be the romantic, the rom-com girl after a while. But
Yeah.
with Vincent Price, it feels if he felt that way, we don't see it, which is great. But also, and I know we're going to get to this, but one thing about that's great about The Fly, the movie, is that he doesn't even he's there and he's a presence, but he's not the presence you necessarily expect him to be, which I think is great. So he built up this credibility anyway with the genre. That's what I'm excited to see during this. It's not the only thing we're talking about today, but it's exciting to me anyway, you know.
Agreed. Yeah. And we're also covering for one movie and probably really only one movie, a particular, you could say, youth movement that got eclipsed by what was going on the next decade, oddly enough, as well.
Yes. The hippie, yeah, the hipsters giving way to the hippies or the beat.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, we'll get there for sure. Okay, by the way, I'm stepping on my lead. The four films of tonight are called Night of the Demon. The US release name was Curse of the Demon, The Fly, House on Haunted Hill, and Bucket of Blood. Okay, let's start with Night of the Demon. I think it's our third and final film directed by Jacques Tourneur on this list.
That's
Does that
correct.
sound
Yeah.
about right to you?
Yeah.
And it's exciting when any director gets three films on this list. I'm excited about it. I'm a fan of Jacques Tourneur's. I always force his movie Out of the Past down my undergraduates' throats, whether they like it
Right.
or not. I think he brings a lot to this film. I was reading about he came in a little late, not late, late. Like the property was getting tossed around a little bit.
Mhm.
RKO was involved. Columbia was involved. There was some argument over like whether they would show the demon or not, and that was a thing.
Yeah. This particular producer was his name Raymond E. Chester. Is that what I'm thinking
That
of?
sounds right. He used to be a child
Yeah.
actor. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, so he had that. He was the basically the big sort of conflict, and I was trying to think about. He was the executive producer, and
Okay.
I think his credit was almost as big of a credit as Jacques Tourneur's in the film, if you look at it as well. So,
I love
which is
comparing font sizes, so go right ahead. Yeah.
exactly, and I think yeah, I'm sure he was probably just one of other sort of larger ups or higher ups who felt the same way in general about, and this is like a general sort of theme that Tourneur always fought against anyway when he actually made any films in the horror genre as well, of just showing not just a little bit here and there and not really being explicitly about the monster and the horror itself, but the unseen rather than the seen.
Yes. There was a little
So
bit of a conflict there, and you can see that that could have hurt it. This is we're gonna hear this in other places too. We're gonna hear about it with Bucket of Blood too, that like later people were like a little dissatisfied with the results, like, oh, we were hoping blank, like if we could do it over again. You
Yeah, that one also has, we'll talk about that one anyway. I have my thoughts about that one. That one may or may not
right.
be my favorite film of this set, which is maybe
Wow.
controversial. But
Wow,
yeah,
my God, that is a little controversial. I'm not,
yeah.
I think for me it's something else, but we'll get to that later. It's interesting you said, yeah, I'll say this about Curse of the Demon, and I don't want to give away too much yet, but presumably if you're listening to this, you've already heard it, because why would you want to have it summarized for you or seen it? But the thing is that the demon himself is a great creation. I know we only see him briefly at the beginning and the end, but I get why there was a desire to have him in the film on some level. And
Hmm.
it's a beautiful, and this kind of gets to another theme of this, all four films, is that there, and this isn't exactly a surprise, but it's the 50s. We've already seen these other movies. We already know what else is going on. So they do have to push the envelope. We can't, the creature from the Black Lagoon, that's not going to do it anymore. We got to go past that. We got to get something scarier, weirder, awful, like more satanic, more kind of awful. And
Right.
right, it's funny, this is still tame by like 70s standards. We're not in the Exorcist territory yet. We're not at the
Hmm.
Wicker Man, but we can get a sense of going, this is a sort of a step along that. Just the fact that the demon's even there. I know that there's a controversy over whether the character should really see him or not, but I'm really happy in a
Mm.
way that he is on screen because he's quite a triumph of design, I would argue, at least.
Yeah, he mostly is. I think the illusion of what he's doing maybe gets broken a little bit when he starts ambling towards us a little bit,
Yeah, the
let's just
wheel.
say.
You're meant to hear these wheel noises, aren't you? I don't
Yeah, I
know.
was trying to figure out whether those noises reminded me of the wheels or whether it's, well, yes, you're right. Actually, I was thinking about, yeah, what was my,
You
I'm
know
trying
what
to
you
look at my
might have been
notes as
comparing the
well.
noise of the wheels to? You might have been comparing it to the noise of the device that Frederick
Yes.
Lauren slash Vincent Price uses toward the end of another movie.
Oh, that's
I
true.
mean,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it sounds,
Yeah, it's a little bit like that as
you know,
well. And
right.
yeah, agreed. So I would say that's what it reminds me for good or for ill, depending on how you feel
Right.
about that particular sound and what you're seeing on screen at that
Well, you
point.
notice it much more in the beginning. So I think that
Yes.
as a first time, I'm sorry, you start when you're watching the movie, the first 15 minutes of the movie, you go, okay, we're eventually going to find out that this was just something that some dude created. But then when you get to the end, you're like, was it? Because there's not those same wheel. You don't have the same auditory. So I almost wonder why the wheels were left in on the audio. I don't know. It's probably
Well,
not a perfectly made film. What is? Like maybe they wanted to do things that they didn't get to do. I don't know. Go ahead.
the
Yes.
other thing too, I think, is towards the end, there are other sort of competing sounds and actions happening as well
Yes.
when the
They're
demon appears
right. It's
too.
hard to hear. There's train
There's
noises.
train noises as well.
Yeah.
There are
Good
other
point.
actions and perils happening at the same time. And then in the first scene where he appears, it's really just all about just power lines, really. That's the
Yeah. That makes me feel like maybe we should just start jump into the plot. We're already
yes.
halfway there, and what the hell? I like talking about the plot. I like knowing what we're all talking about. I think it's fun. I'm gonna just call it Night of the Demon because whatever. That seems
That's what I've been doing, even
call it
though
for
there's a notorious Night of the Demon film
yes.
from America from 1980. That's a cryptid film, let's
It's
just
not
say.
really a remake though, right? It's
No, it's nothing
right.
to do with that at all.
Yeah,
It's just
right.
it's very different.
Very different. Even more different than The Fly is different from the other Fly, from the
Oh, yeah, very
Cronenberg.
much.
It's funny because I was watching, because I actually just saw that I happened to see the Cronenberg Fly recently, and then I'm watching this one and I'm like, man, these are different films. It's yes,
Right.
I get that it is a remake. Like you couldn't try if you were gonna try to do a lawsuit with intellectual property. There's no way Cronenberg doesn't have to pay to use that property, but nonetheless,
Exactly.
we'll get to that later. But it's very different. I'm glad we're covering both because they're very different.
Yes, agreed.
Um, Land of the Demon, now that we're talking about that, begins at Stonehenge, where a narrator tells us these stones can basically control magic. One night, Professor Harrington drives onto the massive grounds of Lufford Hall, knocks on the door of the mansion, enters, begs Dr. Carswell to stop what he's started, earns a vague promise, tells the doctor he doesn't have the rune key, gets chased out, drives home to his wooded estate, sees some kind of 20-foot demon coming up his wood drive, jumps back into his car, panics, backs into a utility pole, causes the electrical portion of that pole to fall, and dies by electrocution just as the wheezing, maybe wheeling demon moves his hand. Okay. Dr. Carswell throws into his fireplace a newspaper saying Devil Cult Expose promised at a convention. There's no accent on it, so I read it wrong. And you're watching the movie, there's no accent on it.
Right.
That newspaper gets thrown in the fire as another newspaper reports that a prominent psychologist is flying to London, and the man in the picture, Dr. John Holden, pulls down the newspaper with his own photo on it, has a back and forth that the fellow airplane passenger arrives at Heathrow and learns that Harrington was found dead that morning. At John Holden's hotel room, two different guests, O'Brien and Kumar, affirm their belief in old tales that Holden's work discredits Kieron. At the research part of the British Museum, Holden is restricted from seeing the true discoveries of witches and demons, but Dr. Carswell appears and invites Holden to see his copy at Lufford Hall. Holden assures Carswell he won't stop exposing his cult, not for this little favor. Carswell hands him back his folder, as well as a card, like a kind of a business card, but with cryptic handwriting that fades when Holden shows it to someone else. Back at the hotel, Holden tells O'Brien and Kumar that this hysteria over demons is comparable to people who believe they've seen flying saucers, which is good for us podcast and the people on this journey with best loved films, because we've seen flying saucers. No, we haven't, but okay. Holden asks if his friends know a tune, and O'Brien asks if Holden is planning to remain after the 28th, because after all, his calendar pages have been torn out. At the funeral, Holden sees his old plane mate, who turns out to be Harrington's niece, Joanna, and meets him at this hotel where she reads from her uncle's diary, which implies that runes have powers and that he was cursed by witchcraft, but John disputes any mystical explanations. By the way, Kieran, interrupt me if I'm getting anything wrong or you want to add anything. The next day, John and Joanna drive to Lufford Hall, where Carswell, dressed as a hobo clown, entertains kids for a Halloween party, greets his two new guests, sends Joanna off to enjoy his mother's homemade ice cream, strolls with Holden, argues over magic, and says, "There, it's done." A ferocious windstorm blows through the estate, closing down the party and forcing Holden and Carswell inside, where Carswell warns a still skeptical Holden that if he continues his investigation, he will die in 3 days at 10 o'clock. Back at the Harrington mansion, hiding from the storm after Joanna shares that her uncle's diary lost all its pages after the 22nd, the day he died, Holden says typical witch doctors warn their victims. Holden opens his folder from the museum to find a parchment that, per Joanna, tries to fall into the fire, but doesn't. Holden drives to Stonehenge to compare the parchment runes to writing on the ancient stones. Joanna brings Holden to the house of a Mr. Meek, who, assisted by Carswell's mother, we saw her with the ice cream earlier, leads a seance where three very different accented people seem to speak through Meek, the third sounding a lot like Joanna's uncle, warning them of a demon that killed him before Holden declares the seance bunk, stands, and leaves. Outside, John and Joanna drive off as Carswell's mother climbs into a car with Carswell, apparently. In the car, Joanna tells Holden she believes the book's translation key could help them, so they drive to Lufford Hall, where Holden scales the fence, walks through the wood. I'm sorry, first he walks through the wood, then he scales the fence, walks through the wood, climbs a wall, breaks in, creeps around, gets to the study, finds the book, reads part, and gets attacked by a house cat that seems to morph into a jaguar that claws and paws at Holden's face and shirt before Carswell enters, makes jokes about his now obvious house cat, reminds Holden about his scheduled death the next night at 10, and advises Holden to exit via the drive. Holden insists on going through the wood he'd already traversed, where mystery footprints happen, like making snow-type impressions in the dirt, and a weird white smoke creature seems to chase Holden down. Did you want to add anything to that?
It's essentially him. We can talk about that. It's him seeing as much of the actual demon without seeing the demon as possible. He sees all the signs, essentially.
Right.
The sign in the beginning is the puff of smoke that happens before the demon shows up at the beginning as well.
Sure. But how would those footprints have been faked anyway? I don't know. Okay. The next morning, oh, wait, sorry. At the police station, after the police react skeptically, Oh, did I? Yeah, yeah. After the police react skeptically, John tells Joanna that he's been acting hysterical, causing her to say, "Oh, like me," and leave in a huff. The next morning, Holden tells his friends he wants to wrap up everything that day as he blows off another one of Mrs. Carswell's phone calls. That evening, Joanna gets in a car, joined by some mysterious, unwelcome person. At the conference, in front of an audience, Holden gives a speech about the effects of hypnosis and hands over the stage to Mr. O'Brien and the catatonic patient, Rand Hobart, who awakens in a panic until Holden hypnotizes him. Backstage, O'Brien and Holden grill hypnotized Hobart, who confesses to devil love and giving the parchment back to Harrington to let the demon kill him. But when O'Brien wakens him with the sight of the parchment, Hobart freaks out and throws himself out of a high window and dies. In the aftermath, Kumar tells Holden that Mrs. Carswell revealed her son to be on an 8:45 train to Southampton, which Holden barely catches. At 9:54, Holden enters the train car of Carswell and Joanna, wakes Joanna from hypnosis, and prevents Carswell from leaving until after 10. When police interrupt, Carswell rushes to leave without even his coat, which Holden passes to him, causing Carswell to realize, "You passed it," as the parchment key flies out of his pocket down the train hallway and out onto the tracks where Carswell chases it until it dissolves in fire and Kieran, the big demon, shows up, attacks, and kills Carswell. As the police try to figure out how a train killed Carswell on the wrong tracks on the nearby platform, Joanna tells John it might be better not to know, and he agrees. Okay, that's the movie.
Yep.
Fascinating film for a lot of
Yes.
reasons. I thought it was when you go online, they're basically giving what was the article I read? It was by Scoville, Nick Scoville, maybe, where he was
Mm.
talking about how this movie was basically the second one after Haxan. And if you count Haxan, I know we started our journey with Haxan, but you know how Haxan was presented as a documentary. It isn't, but it was made that way. Like
Mm.
before people, everything was like rigidly, the word documentary hadn't even really been coined yet, but it's presented as like a here's what really happened in the medieval times. Whereas this movie, if you're not counting Haxan, because it's certainly not trying to say that it doesn't have that kind of documentary framing, you could argue it's like the very first folk horror.
Mm.
Yeah, or certainly a pioneer in that and
Agreed.
really important to future folk horror films. So yeah, go ahead. What
Yeah, agreed. No, that's definitely considered one of the early versions of folk horror. I think there are some other stories from other countries, I believe. I'm trying to
yeah,
remember my
which I don't
history a
know.
little bit as far as some other versions of other stories that that happened around the same time. I think there might have been one in Italy as well. I'm trying to remember the actress, but it was more about it was this basically this younger peasant woman who basically gets shunned by everyone because they say that she's a demon or that she's possessed by the devil, essentially.
Mhm.
And I forget if that was late 50s or if it was early 60s. I think it's
Okay,
someone like Dahlia
right.
Levy. Dahlia Levy. I'm trying to
Hmm.
remember her name. But that's one of the other earlier ones. I
Yeah,
think there's,
they mention occult night movies that this guy Scoville does. He mentions Night of the Eagle, The Devil
mhm.
Rides Out, The Blood on Satan's Claw, Psychomania.
Right. Those are later though.
Those
So
are,
yeah.
yeah, you're right. No, you're right. And then Kate Bush's 1985 song Hounds of Love. I don't know.
Yes.
What these
But
images.
yeah, Hounds of Love, I believe references this particular
Yeah,
movie, if I remember
right.
correctly.
Yeah, yeah, there you go. Yeah. Yeah, it's cool. It's funny. I mean, in some ways you don't even need the Stonehenge stuff, but I guess they throw it in to give it a little bit more of, hey, there's always been these creepy devil worshiping
There's
things.
always been the runes, essentially, too,
Right.
right? I'm
Yeah.
trying to think about other artifacts that are as famous with the runic lettering as well,
Sure. No,
or
I can't,
that were
honestly.
so.
No, these are as famous as any, right?
Yeah, exactly. Did
Well,
you
the Rosetta Stone. Yeah, but go ahead.
exactly? Did you get to see Stonehenge before they walled it off or became?
Yeah, I saw it in '06. I saw it in '05 and when I lived there. I don't think it was walled off. There were certain places you couldn't really go. There were places you don't really they tell you to stay on the path and I didn't try, although I it wasn't really if you were to make a run for it, you could. But it's
Oh,
just
interesting.
thought
I
that
was
if you
wondering that
did,
as well. So I know
yeah.
there was like in different decades there were different acts of vandalism
Oh
that
wow.
made things easier or more difficult depending on what was going on for us to be able to view Stonehenge. My only memory of it was actually like going up to it up close back in 1980.
Nice.
So yeah, it was
Richmond.
interesting to see that. And it was great to see the scale of Stonehenge
Sure.
also in this particular film because of that.
I think in Spinal Tap, it's accurate, right? Stonehenge is 12 inches high.
It is, yes.
Okay, just
I
checking
measured
with you.
myself with other little people as well, as I was about
Okay,
that same height.
right. Yeah, that makes sense, especially considering we're going from Incredible Shrinking Man to The Fly, so that makes sense.
Exactly. It's all done to scale, of course.
Ugh.
Let's see. There's some interesting things I want to talk about. Mostly, we can talk about what the role of science is in this film compared to the next film that we're talking about.
Oh, please.
Compare and contrast. Essentially, this particular science is being used, and logic and things, seeing things in front of us, and all that is being used basically to essentially deny, essentially, right? Let me see here. Just looking for my
Yeah, I was noticing
So is it
that
either to disprove things, or you either want to disprove things or discover things, essentially,
yeah.
with science. When you use a scientific method, you're trying to discover something new, essentially, and use a scientific method to confirm that, or using the scientific method to debunk things and disprove things. And we've got someone very much in the latter camp, essentially, the main character, who's in the habit of disproving things. And it's been talked about by other scholars that this is like a form of a pathology, probably based upon his childhood, of him wanting to control things, essentially.
Yeah.
And because of that, it just makes it more interesting that he wants to control things that he realizes as the film goes on that he cannot control as well. And his
Yeah.
antagonist also is using those particular things as control over his group of people, over his followers, essentially. But he also needs control over over that particular thing, essentially,
Sure.
as well, too.
But
So there,
does he ever really, the lead, does he ever really get a comeuppance? I feel like John Holden,
no, he does not.
there almost ought to be him. I don't know, after that windstorm scene, you expected at some point he's gonna have to confront that he was wrong the whole time. And I almost think it's a little too easy for him.
It's a little easy that it basically takes somebody to jump and throw himself out of a window, essentially, for him to believe, essentially, at the last minute. So there's a
Right.
bit of a
Yeah.
last
Thank
minute,
you.
oh, I guess I was wrong, or maybe I should just find
I
this
don't even,
out.
by the way, when he goes in that train car and says he was wrong, I don't really buy that. I think he's just trying to do it it's all to get to pass the parchment and stuff. I don't know.
Right. But I mean, if he really didn't care, he wouldn't be passing the parchment, I suppose,
Right.
right?
By the way, it's the William Holdenness of the 50s. They even name the character Holden, maybe because they knew they couldn't get William Holden. And we'll get somebody, we'll get Danny Andrews. We'll just tell him to act
Right.
Holden.
Yeah, there was a relationship between Dana Andrews and Jacques Tourneur anyway, the director.
Oh,
So
sure. Turner is his work is one of the best things about the film. I mean that it keeps you guessing and it makes it gives it the creepiness that it needs, where you're still wondering if there really is a demon, if say even with the windstorm and with some other things that almost have to be mystical, you're still like, but is it?
there's the particular sort of hallucinated, there's a few different scenes where it's like woozy vision that happens, that Dana Andrews, that Holden goes through, like when now McGinnis, when Carswell basically shows up in the library the first time
Yeah.
and has his encounter with him, and unbeknownst to him passes him the runes, and Holden looks back at him, and then he goes off in this weird sort of hazy photographic effect as he walks away.
Yeah.
That
I
photographic
like
effect,
that. That was
yeah,
a
that
cool
happens
moment
a
of the
second
movie.
time also
Right.
after he accidentally, when he goes into the farm, the Hobart farm, and
Yeah.
the parchment just pops out, and they see him and basically realize who he is, and then he just looks, and then all of a sudden they have the same, I don't know what you would call that particular camera trickery. It seems like a very particular bit of camera trickery that I hadn't seen before.
I
So
liked it. Yeah, you need a master like Turner with you to help, and maybe a good DP too. Yeah, to do that. But yeah, it's a kind of that's a woo effect. Yeah, no, I think yeah, I see why that critics have rushed to recover this film and say, okay, it really is strong because it is. There's a genuinely creepy vibe here because of the folk horror thing that we're not really used to yet.
right.
Context, I think that's a big part of it. The idea that this is like 1,000 years old and there's been people or more, and the people have been worshiping devils, and we don't really know why. And I think there's something there. I
There's
think
the Hexen part of it as well, too, when he's with the other scientists and they're going through the different sort of various
yeah.
different stone cuts and
That's
drawings,
good, yeah.
right? So,
Did we have paranormal experts in movies before this film? Because don't David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson owe their careers to this film? I don't, maybe I'm wrong.
we're going to be covering a particular film that has that a little bit. What year is
But
that
this
film
idea of
in? But
paranormal, like we hadn't been paranormal, there's paranormal activity. That's
yeah, we'll be covering that. But there will be like mediums. There will be at least one medium in a
sure.
particular film that we'll be covering soon as well. But
Well,
yes,
you
it
know what
hasn't
I
happened
say.
yet.
You know what I say, Kieran. The medium is the message.
Exactly. The whole scene where he actually like breaks into the house as well, there's some
Yeah.
disorienting things where he basically goes down the stairs essentially,
I
and
saw
there's
that stair
like a
thing.
few
Yeah.
scenes where like this hand where he's going down the stairs and the
Yeah,
hand shows up at the banister,
what
and
was
then we go
that?
back to the actual
You have a
staircase and
hand.
there's nobody back there essentially,
Right.
right?
And then and in like consecutive shots, hand.
Hmm.
Yeah. It's almost it's funny when I saw there's a recent play, Clue. The play is based on the 1985 or 86 Tim Curry movie Clue, right?
Yep.
And in Clue, the play, you'll have these hands come like random hands, like gloved hands come from like libraries and like the pool table will just make a move or something on a character or plant evidence or remove evidence or something. And you're like,
Oh, interesting.
whose hand? And they half explain it by the end ish. But these hands, I'm like, this is great.
So like play and not musical.
This is a play, yeah. Clue,
Okay, I
it's
was
touring
wondering as
right now,
well.
yeah.
Okay,
But I'm
yeah,
just saying
that's
this idea of like hands, like you almost have to be in a horror genre to get away with something like this.
we can all just talk about the Addams Family, of course,
But
for
yeah,
example.
and
Yeah,
clearly that was already a thing at this point.
yes, so to speak, yes.
You
Yeah,
know,
the cast is uniformly very strong as
very
well,
good.
too. It's
Jane
all very
Andrews
well
is well
cast.
cast. He's a good
Yeah, I was
role.
surprised. I didn't realize that, what's her name? Peggy Cummins. I forgot that she was the femme fatale in Gun Crazy.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah, nice one. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
she
cool.
was really, yeah, I forgot how, yeah, that was, yeah,
We
she was
shouldn't
very good.
we don't want to know what kind of ethnicity the guy playing Professor Kumar was. We assume he's white and in brown face, but
Yes,
it's
no,
not
we assume
asked.
that this is basically what made 10 years after the independence, basically, right?
Sure. I'm
So
just
it
saying,
seems to be it
yeah,
seems to track as far as like an independence
sure,
or some sort of traumatic or big world event where someone retains independence, and if there's a particular country that's been colonized for a while or some sort of oppressed group, if it all of a sudden gets some sort of newfound less repression, there's slightly more representation of
sure,
it, but there's initial representation of it might not be portrayed as sensitively as it is like in future generations, let's
sure.
just say.
It could have been worse. They could have had him being like, "Here's why my culture knows about voodoo" or something.
Right, exactly. There's
Um,
also much worse, even later representations of even more famous actors in brown face looking at you, Peter Sellers. So,
thank you. Yeah, different
so
Peter.
yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm glad you compare it to the next film because I know one thing that I noticed about this film and The Fly have in common is that the one foreigner is the biggest skeptic and like almost authority. Now, foreigner is loosely defined. In this movie, in Curse of the Demon, clearly he's the American and the American
Yes.
coming in as the skeptic. But the movie we're about to talk about, it's Montreal, although you can barely tell that.
Yeah, we could talk
But the
about that.
cop is French, or he seems more French than any other major character, if that makes sense. And he's the skeptic. He's the John Holden of The Fly. It's different, but he's the guy who's, come on, you got to be kidding me. There's no way this is real.
The other two things that these two films that we're the first this one and the one that we're about to talk
Yeah,
about are
go ahead.
actually based on short stories as well, where
Yep.
the other two aren't as well. I read both
And
of them as well.
and aren't they both based on relatively recent short stories, like from the
Well,
50s?
M.R. James, not so recent, but The
Okay.
Fly is, yeah, the M.R. James was a little bit, I think he had already passed away by that point as well, if I remember correctly.
Oh,
He's,
okay. All right. So not that recent.
yeah,
But it's a time when these people are like, okay, what hasn't been made? We know horror is already doing pretty well. So if we can get a story that's good enough, that's already happening.
exactly. And we can talk about the origins of the short story for the next film. We might as
Well,
well
go
just do
ahead. You
that
know
as
what?
well.
why don't you go ahead and take it away? I think I'm personally I'm okay with that, and we need to for time anyway, unless
Right.
you want to go
So
ahead.
that short story was actually first published in Playboy magazine.
Oh, wow.
It was
Didn't know that.
actually a French author or a French Canadian author, but it
Oh,
was actually
wow.
taking place in
Yeah.
France originally,
Okay.
and then they adapted it as when they made the adaptation with another soon to be very famous author himself, who was also
Oh, James
responsible.
Clavell.
Yes, James
Yeah, the
Clavell,
guy
right?
who would make
Yes,
Shogun.
the guy made Shogun as well. This is his first screenwriting credit, obviously. But then they made some they of course like it's one of those things where we're also with this and the previous film when you think about adaptations of short stories, what you do to beef things up to feature length essentially. In the short story for Night of the Demon, there's no daughter of the murdered uncle in this case. So it's really all about the investigator and his foe essentially. In this case, for The Fly, there are a few different things that are different from the plot that we can all explain once we go over the plot as well. Like a few crucial things, a
Yeah.
few things that have to be added because we need to make a feature essentially. So
And plus, let's get Vincent Price more involved. I don't know anything.
exactly.
Do you want me to cover the plot now, or should I?
Sure.
Okay, because I can jump in. That's good. Okay, yeah. Give me a second here. It's funny you said that. I just want to react to what you said for a second. I didn't know it until you said it, but now that you mention it, there is something kind of French about kind of everything. The way
Yes.
in which I don't know what I mean by that, but it's like there's a decorum to the way people are that they're like, okay, I have to check on this. There's almost like bureaucratic. Oh, you can just pass me notes through the door and I'll
Hmm.
just take that and I'll just do what you said kind of thing. And like,
Right.
oh, you could have something on your head and I don't have to look. There's a way in which there's like a decorum here that I feel like that actually makes so when you tell me that it was originally set in France, it makes almost more sense. Okay, since you've given me the green light or the green eyes. Okay, honestly, by the way, this is probably my favorite film of the four, I think. I'm not sure.
Oh, interesting.
I love this film. There's something about it that we don't have to compare it to the Cronenberg. I don't know. Those are they're so different. They're very apples. They're like apples and papayas or something to me.
Uh-huh.
Okay, but at night at Delambre Freres Electronics, Gaston, the watchman, strokes a stray cat and strolls into the machine warehouse where he sees a woman, Helene, running away from a bloody mess in the hydraulic press. Helene and Gaston separately tell the truth via phone to Francois Delambre, who calls Inspector Charles. How do I pronounce his name? Charas? How would you say that? Charas? I don't know.
I believe so, yeah.
Charas. It's like Charles, but without an L. Charas,
Exactly.
who joins Francois at the warehouse where they and the other EMTs are all mystified at the gruesome death of Francois's brother, Andre, identified by his distinctive leg scar. Chara's Dr. Ejute and Francois come to the ritzy house of Helene Delambre, who says she can't explain why she killed her husband, even as she waves a fly off a lamp. Cheris and a baffled, bewildered Francois explore Andre's disheveled lab, where Cheris recommends Francois look after his nephew Philippe, something Helene makes easier by acting as though her son isn't her son. In her bedroom, a recumbent Helene begs her nurse not to swat a buzzing fly, but when the nurse knocks the fly down, Helene leaps from the bed and cries to see the injured insect. At a meal, Philippe asks about how long flies live and tells his uncle Francois about a white-faced fly that appeared the day his father went away. In Helene's bedroom, after Francois begs her for the truth, she admits to pretending insanity for Philippe's sake and reluctantly agrees to tell the truth to Francois and Charis. She won't say it twice if Francois agrees to destroy the living white-headed fly he says he captured. In Helene's flashback, Helene and Philippe play joyfully until Andre pulls her into his spacious, organized, ray gun gothic-ish lab where he shows her his new disintegrator integrator, which crackles and zizzes as it moves an ashtray from one box to another. Andre compares the tech to TV and the effect to a revolution which will cure poverty, although Helene points out that the small writing on the ashtray got reversed. Later, Andre tweaks, puts the newspaper in the disintegrator box, likes the result, puts Dandelo the cat in the disintegrator and sees two empty boxes, but hears distant meowing in the walls. What? On the that never made sense. On the by the way, there's a cat theme going on in these movies that we got to get. Cats in the 50s, I'm telling you, it was a thing. Dogs not so much. Just at least not in these movies. Um, okay, so on the phone, Francois laughs to hear Helene complain about Andre's constant busyness, but when she hangs up, Andre appears to take her to the ballet. He does appear. He appears in the room, meaning he shows up to take her to the ballet. Although while there, he does scribble ideas on his program. Back at the lab, Andre teleports a bottle of champagne, which comes through with its accurate label, and then he teleports a guinea pig, which comes through fine as well, prompting Andre to admit he doesn't know exactly why he lost the cat. Francois arrives for a rare lab visit, but he and Helene come to the lab to see a note saying they can't come in. With his butterfly net, Philippe catches an unusual white-headed fly, but Helene reminds him of rules about animals and makes him throw the fly into the wild. Helene comes to the locked lab door to read an elaborate typed note shoved under the bottom, which she obeys, going to the kitchen and bringing to the lab a bowl of rum-laced milk. There, a black shroud wearing Andre slurps up the milk as Helen suggests, since he says he can't talk, how about one knock for yes, two for no? When Helen tells him that she made Philippe let go the fly, Andre stands in a panic, revealing a hand that looks more like a left hand that looks more like a hairy black lobster claw, causing her to scream as his good hand points insistently to the door. In another type note through the door, Andre says he can't talk, but he'll explain everything in the morning. The next day, Helen comes to the lab to read that a fly accidentally got into the new man-sized transporter with Andre. Their atoms combined, and now Andre's only hope is for someone to find the white-headed fly. Helen commands their housekeeper, Emma, and Philippe to catch, not kill, the right fly, and get snappy with them when they don't. When the white-headed one shows up, they chase it through the living room and lose it in the garden. That evening in the lab, when Andre types of his brain strain and desire to destroy all evidence, including himself, Helen begs him to let the other scientists come, but at his refusal, she insists that he try the transporter again. When he goes through, she pulls off his shroud to reveal a human head-sized fly head that sees her scream in a kaleidoscopic pattern before she faints. After his fly hand seems to grab her with a life of its own, she awakens to watch him axe destroying his lab equipment and writing final instructions on the chalkboard, including killing the white-headed fly. She follows him as he walks to the warehouse, sets up the hydraulic press, places himself in it, and lets himself get crushed to death. Back in the present, after Helene finishes her story, Francois walks Charis out to the front door, where Charis says he'll return with people to arrest Helene for murder unless Francois can find that fly. Outside, Francois sits on a bench, ignoring a nearby spider web and a small voice saying, "Help me," as he sees the police and asylum workers arrive. But when they enter the bedroom, an outraged Helene beseeches Charis and Francois, who admits he lied about trapping the one fly. Ooh, liar. In the hall, as Francois tries to reassure Philippe, the boy tells him he just saw the one fly in a bench-adjacent spider web. So Francois gathers Charis and brings him outside to the spider web, where they both watch as a webbed-up fly-sized thing with an Andre-looking white head wails, "Help me," as the spider eats him and Charis seizes a big rock and kills both bugs, apparently. Charis calls Mini Andre's scream something he will never forget, as he and Francois sort out a way to blame Andre's death on suicide. In a coda in the garden, Helene, Philippe, and Francois play croquet, as Helene calls Francois a good man. Okay, I could talk about this for a while and why I like this movie so much, but first I want to hear from you, Kieran. Thoughts?
I like it, but I'm not as big a fan of it, I think, as you are, which is
Okay, go
interesting
ahead.
as well. So
Yeah.
there are a lot of things that struck my eye about it.
Please.
The opening credits are just a good in general sequence.
Yes,
It's a
those are
great sort
nice.
of, yeah, the musical sequence. The music is strong there. The close-ups of the metal screen going from red to green to red
Yeah.
again, and then
And
the
that's
fly comes
actually
out as well.
That's going to be the closest we are to any fly, basically until the last 5 minutes of the movie, really, unless
Right.
if we're counting that what we saw in that spider web as a fly.
The closest, yeah. There are
Yeah.
different other flies that they try to find as well. There's the jar of flies
Yep. I
that
really
they.
like the fly photography in this movie. That's going to sound weird. I think it's actually very clever to keep them at a bit of a distance, like
Mhm.
most of the movie. That's a great choice. It sets up very well that ending, I think, because you never know if you got a little closer and what you might see. And once you finally do get that close, the movie's been tickling you to that. Once you get there and then you see a human head, it
Yeah,
for me
yeah.
it's an effective it's very effective, I think. Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, I think it's pretty effective. I try not to think too much about how somewhat ridiculous it is in some ways, but the other interesting thing too, after the murder happens and they spend a lot of time going back and forth over to the bedroom for Helene, every time they go into there, there's an overhead shot as well of them going in there. So it reminds me of like sort
Yeah.
of fly's eye view in a way of the
Yes,
shot
thank
because of
you.
that. So
Nice. Well
that
said.
is actually nice. It's also interesting that Helen wouldn't hurt a fly,
Yeah,
and
line.
a
Yeah,
year later, there's
caught
Robert
that.
Bloch's novel as well.
Right.
The I'll keep talking about Vincent Price and his other sort of huge interest of being just a wonderful sort of art collector as well.
He-
Um,
He's
the
great at
thing,
playing that. You
yeah,
believe.
he's no, it's where he was in real life as well,
Okay.
too,
Oh,
is
maybe
what I'm
that's
saying.
why it's so
So yeah, he was definitely in real life. And I think I mentioned that in the last episode because of
you
that.
did.
And the other thing too is that I believe he and Edward G. Robinson actually were very good friends, and also both of them were very good art collectors. And there was a
Mm,
particular quiz show that he was on that were
mm.
both on. I think it was a $64,000 quiz or something like that, if I remember correctly. And it may or may not, it wasn't the particular quiz show that had the quiz show scandal from the 50s, but it had
Okay.
a similar type of scandal as well. But he
Okay.
became very well known in television actually because of his appearance on that particular quiz show. And
Okay.
the quiz show was all about him and his expertise about art essentially as well.
Okay. Oh, cool. All right. I
So,
feel like,
which made
wait, what
me
does this
think,
have to do with the fly, though? But
so
go
what made me think about that, a nod to him and his art collection was if you look at the actual like Francois study, where his phone is, where he gets the phone call essentially at the beginning of the scene, there's the fireplace, there's a painting up above there. The painting looks like a Modigliani up there.
yes.
So I
Do
just
you think
thought
that might
I
belong
think
to
that it might have been some sort of like a
Prices?
nod for Vincent and his particular collections as well, of his interest
Yeah.
and his interest in art as well. The other thing I was thinking about as well when Andre was talking about just his ideas about the transporter and how it's not so different, somewhat different. I think everyone in every sort of the film industry was definitely thinking about television and its impact during
Right.
this particular
You could
decade.
argue this is a reaction to that.
This
Look,
is a bit of a reaction to it because he also talks about how the transporter and his idea
right.
is not much
Yeah.
different from television
Right.
waves, radio waves, and
Sure.
everything as well. Made me think about what happened to Mike TV and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory as well.
No,
So,
that's fair.
um,
I was looking up that 20th Century Fox even got involved with this. That was a fascinating thing because Fox had not done horror or almost not. So it's
yeah, this is
sort of
basically like an independent production. Robert
it
Lippert, I believe,
was,
was
but
mostly like an independent producer of some other
yes,
horror films as well beforehand, and he got a
right.
particular deal, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, he did, but I guess they were impressed enough. They thought, okay, we don't normally do horror, but in this case, yeah, and they did. It's like a $400,000 budget, which
Yes,
and color CinemaScope. Those were all pretty big numbers for a kind of a minor for a film that was presumably only going to get the audience that went to see Tarantula and Them and whatever else.
right.
So it's pretty impressive, and I think it pays off actually. I think Kurt Newman's or Neumann, whatever his, I like the direction. It's understated. It feels like you must be in Montreal because there's nothing extravagant about it. There's a
Right.
decided ordinariness to it as you're trying to figure out if you have never seen it, what exactly did happen? Why did she murder her husband this way?
I was trying to think about also with the fly as well and the different kinds of flies in the world, like sort of fly, if it were full grown, would be a carnivorous fly, which seems to be like the concern essentially with with the fly essentially that his fly brain taking over his human brain essentially. So there's this concern because of that towards the throughout the film. It gets more and more pronounced. There's this war between his fly persona and his human essentially battling each other out for supremacy basically. And
Yeah.
for some reason it becomes a bit of a 50s sort of monster movie
Yeah.
because of that sort of the end, whether it made me think what fly would be like this in real life in particular. Usually they're more scavengers than anything else,
Yeah, they're
though.
not exactly right. I know what you mean. It's almost like he's got half Wolfman or something inside.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Or Jekyll and Hyde. It felt a little right. Oh, my arm. I have to stop my arm from trying to grab this woman. I agree that was a bit of a problem, although it moves pretty quick in the movie. Like he's so bothered by his arm even starting to get with
Yes,
this woman that he starts taking his good arm starts taking an axe to the machine. So
I know. That is
but they
pretty
don't
funny.
they don't drag out the Wolfman Jekyll and Hyde aspects too much. I think if they had dragged it out for a minute or two more, you're absolutely right that it would have gone completely off the rails. You would have been like, why does a fly act this way? It doesn't
Yeah,
make sense. A fly would be looking for feces to rub its nose.
exactly. Which would have been a no-go in the 50s anyway. So
Yeah, no. Although, right, each of these movies has its own way of like pushing the envelope of what was
exactly. But yeah,
possible.
the opening scene definitely pushes the envelope anyway, as
Yeah.
far as the how bloody it is also.
Yes.
Um, the other thing, reading the short story, comparing to what they expanded upon, the short story is essentially pretty similar. Like it's mostly Francois is mostly the narrator until basically Hélène doesn't get hornswoggled by Francois into telling him the whole story. She basically is like how she is at the beginning of her interrogation, where she basically says, I can't tell you anything, essentially. She's basically like that throughout most of the story, or like the first part of the story. And then basically Francois gets a letter that basically explains the entire backstory that happens. And what happens after he reads that, she basically kills herself.
Oh, wow.
And the inspector basically reads the story, thinks this is completely hogwash, and asks Francois, have you even seen this fly? He said, yes, I did actually go and see this particular fly in this spider web. I just saw him outside and I just killed him, basically. Killed him with
Oh,
a
wow,
rock.
that is different. So Cheris has to take Francois's word for it in that.
Yeah, and he doesn't believe him really at the end,
Yeah.
essentially. And it's already
Sure.
too late because she's already killed herself, right? So,
Wow. I actually was going to say that I think one of the strongest things about this story, and it's compares to all our 50s movies, and well, in some ways, all of our movies, but certainly the four that we're talking about today, is that the woman, this might be, I could go back, but I think whoever the actress playing Helene, she might have the most lines or screen time of any female character that we're talking about in these four films. But it's not just that.
mhm.
It's that Patricia Owens. It's not just that. It's the fact that like this thing of a woman being taken away, for being crazy, the cops there, the mental asylum workers there, that is a horrible fear. And I think that it's true that the movie doesn't like really linger on it, but it also is aware of it too. When you think of the way that's done in, for example, a movie like A Woman Under the Influence, the John Cassavetes movie, I think you know what
Uh-huh.
I'm talking about. I mean, that horror of a woman basically being considered insane, not believed,
Yeah.
we're taking you away now. That is a horror that this movie also speaks to, and it's a lot less metaphorical than being turned into a fly. And I think it's aware of that. That is one thing. And obviously, the Jeff Goldblum, Gina Davis movie has nothing to do with that. And that's fine. It's fine. Actually, I love that movie for what it is. It's a lot of fun. And arguably, it's more fun to watch Goldblum fall apart, the fingernails fall apart. I get why people love that. But I do think this movie gets at certain things. And that when they were there, taking her away, I was like, oh my God, I was creeped out then. And I think that my nerves, because of that happening, were set on edge for the moment of the help me. And when the camera gets down there and sees the spider
Uh-huh.
coming, because that to me is legitimate. I don't know. I must be crazy because I've seen this movie before a long time ago, this 1958 movie, but I got scared. Or not someone scared. I'm watching a movie. I know it's a movie, but that
Right.
was terrifying for just a second. This thought that you were there, the spider. I don't know. I felt like they did a good job with all that. You and I are going to just have to agree to disagree on how much.
Right. It's still like an impressive, I know it's still, I think, impressive and different from what I know Vincent Price and Herbert Marshall said that they were spent a lot of their time with multiple takes essentially because they were laughing a lot about the whole ridiculousness of it as
Yeah,
well.
I
So,
saw that.
yeah.
I,
Yeah,
in
exactly. A
the
lot of people
context.
sort of do that anyway everyone has their own sort of opinions for good or for ill about what they're doing anyway, about the films that they're in. And,
It was a time of bugs. It was a time of them,
yes.
of Tarantula. Buddy Holly named his band the Crickets. There were these guys, you'll never have heard of them, named John Lennon and Paul McCartney across the ocean who said, okay, there's the Crickets, there were like two other bands, and they were like, why don't we name ourselves the Beatles? Because that one isn't taken, but we'll change it to Beat, because that's clever, because that's another bug that there were bug crazes. That's what John Waters is talking about in Hairspray. Is that's
Hmm.
why they're walking around that way. It's like I'm just saying, so it's like, I don't know. This movie, it's trivia, but it's not. It was a cool, like it's its own weird comment on the times as much as Bucket of Blood is of kind of what was hip then, if that makes any sense. So I don't know.
Right.
I get it, and it works, I think.
Okay, yeah. No, there are a lot of things, like I said, to like about it, but I definitely wouldn't say it's my favorite
No,
necessarily.
it worked on me. That
Yeah.
spider coming in. Now I know why that I guess it was John Peters and Peter Guber at Sony were telling Kevin Smith he had to put a spider in the final Superman act. We saw it in Incredible Shrinking Man too, but this was it. This was the getting eaten. This was really it. This was like, yeah.
Right. And I don't know if Kevin Smith, he might have been, if he'd been talked about the spider notes, if that was given before or after it came out also.
It was after,
It was
certainly
after,
after.
so
Arachnophobia is like 1990. Yeah, so
yeah,
it's
okay,
like
that makes
right.
sense then.
But yeah, no.
So then we can also talk about leading to the next film about how hysteria in a woman also plays a very important part plot wise with the next film as well too.
We are hearing the word hysteria in many movies, aren't we? And that's certainly just a word that we keep hearing come up again and again. And we
Hmm.
did just see in Curse of the Demon when basically she is, oh, so I'm hysterical, and she leaves the
Right.
police station. And absolutely, that's a thing. And actually, I'm proud when I see because my growing up, when you and I did, Kieran, we probably had a lot of feminist influence, and we know by now we know that associating hysteria with the same part of the body as the hysterectomy is not exactly like a gender neutral term. No. And but I think it's not like this movies necessarily know that, but they do weirdly. Or like a movie like Curse of the Demon is, yeah, what are you? Oh, okay, you're hysterical like me, are
This
you?
has
I
been
like
talked about since the
yeah.
beginning, since the first film that we talked about
Yes.
in this first episode, essentially, with
Yeah.
Hexen, essentially. So
Right.
this is a
No.
historical thing of
Historical and
using the
hysterical.
ideas of
Yes.
hysteria or different other terms, being associated with some sort of mental illness that was being foisted upon or labeled upon with women to basically spirit them away for many different sort of nefarious reasons, essentially, in their lives. So,
Yes. And what looks like it's about to happen with Helene at the end of this. That is I thought I actually like that we're like outside the room and these guys are taking forever. I almost wonder if they're
right.
kind of sitting there waiting for like Peter Falk to talk her into it, like the way those guys did in that John
Mhm.
Sayles movie. Did I say John Sayles, John Cassavetes? I'm getting my Saleses and Waterses and everybody else confused. Excuse me. You've just given me a terrific segue into the next film. Should I take advantage of that or do
Yes,
okay,
certainly.
all right. I could go either way. As you can see, I'm a huge fan of The Fly. I wouldn't have done this list without this, really, because that's how much I think of it. But yes. Wait, so did you want to say anything about the hysteria or lack thereof in House on Haunted Hill?
It's essentially, we'll talk about the plot as well, but the plot
I
is, and what certain characters are doing, and essentially, and preying upon particular characters may be prone to hysteria-ness, if that's a word.
it is
And
now.
and how that sort of moves the plot along, and you don't really know that that is what the actual plot is. It's similar to what happens in Diabolique, actually, you could say, as far as where
Yeah.
there's a particular A plot that we think is what the actual plot of the film is, but it's a
Mhm.
misdirection to what actually is going on in the
Right.
movie.
Yeah, I felt like watching House on Haunted Hill. It was slightly closer to, I don't know about Agatha Christie. We'd seen this old dark house, and
Hmm.
we the old dark house, and we'd seen Dead of Night, and you've got a room of a house or a room of 5 or 6 people, and like one of them, you're not sure. There's going to be one of them that you can't trust. This was the kind of the one where you're like, oh, finally, one of the kind of the B characters emerges as like the real evil or half. Maybe evil is putting it strongly, but like I feel like we've been waiting for that with the old Dark House and Dead of Night and maybe one or two, and finally we got it. We were like, okay,
Exactly.
and that sets up what we want in these kinds of things, that like an Agatha Christie story. Okay, one of them. And by the way, there's always that one German-ish doctor, right? There's that one.
Right.
You've got to have that
Some sort of
character.
rational character who in this case actually really is sinister. Let's just say to spoil
Yeah,
him, but yeah.
that's what's funny is Frederick Lauren, it's in the movie that he's saying, I wasn't sure who to invite to the party, but him inviting even like his decision to invite that doctor almost reads the way that like I don't know what like he'd seen it from a movie somewhere. It's like the guy making King Kong in the movie King Kong,
Mm,
or the guy getting the ape has to get a blonde because he's seen it in a movie, so he's gonna.
right.
It's almost like that. But I wanted, maybe I didn't mention this already. Speaking of meta aspects, and I just want to go back to the final minute of The Fly for just a second. I felt that when she said to him at the very end, and I know I ended with my summary of The Fly, when she said, you're a good man, Francois. I felt like there was a weird meta, like, you know, the audience has been expecting that you were going to be like the creep the whole time, but you're not. In this particular case,
Mm,
you're a good man. There was a way in which that line worked on double levels. And personally, I love that Vincent Price is there. And then he's in this, which is more of the role. This movie that we're about to talk about is much more the one that kids associate with like him being, so, well, whatever, him being either the mastermind or kind of the one pulling the strings, if you will.
yes.
Okay, so I don't have, I was just, I mean, I did read about the production of this. Not much. Sound stages. They went to the Enos house in for the exteriors. We used Frank Lloyd Wright's house in Los Feliz.
Had been used in other films before this.
I don't know. There was something I saw a documentary a long time ago that talked about it. It was excited about the documentary I saw was all about Blade Runner, or it was like, oh
Mm,
God, wasn't this used well in Blade Runner? And like,
right.
how? Whereas like this was almost like a footnote, House on Haunted Hill, but I don't know what it was used for before that. Yeah, it's interesting because Frank Lloyd Wright would have died. He died in 1959. I don't know if they, I mean, wait, now you got me looking up the dates. Did they wait till he was dead and then they started to make it? Because it's funny, like maybe they thought that they didn't want him to get in their way or something or stop. I don't know. Maybe he wouldn't care. I
Right.
don't,
Or maybe that laughter that goes out, that's in the film like a few times is the laughter of Frank Lloyd Wright.
or his estate still making money, right? Thank you.
Exactly.
Or his granddaughter Ann Baxter and
Oh, right.
her laughing over the ending of All About Eve one more time. No, I'm kidding. That would not make sense. Okay, all right. Yeah, it was a production. It was not, it was a relatively low budget-ish production. It's William Castle. What do we know about William Castle? You want to tell the people anything about William Castle, Kieran?
I don't know too much about him except
Okay,
for he was definitely a descendant of making just the promotion of movies themselves like a show unto themselves, really,
yeah, that
and getting
sounds about
people into
right.
movies.
Yeah,
And no press is bad press, essentially.
sure,
If people are up in arms about scenes of horror, we'll have to get higher actors to protest the particular screenings of these films so that people will
sure.
know that's what's going on in here. So maybe they'll be more interested. So
Yeah,
he's the master of that. There's a sort of a great homage that a particular director will be seeing of him later. Joe Dante made the great film called Matinee,
yeah,
which is also
yes.
like a great sort of
Oh, nice.
homage to like what William Castle did as well. My first experience of him was actually a double bill at the PFA, the Pacific Film Archive, back in
Wow.
the 80s of Homicidal and The Tingler. The Tingler is infamous because it has a sort of gimmick or
Oh,
like an
I knew
in-audience
we were going to
gimmick
get to
of,
this.
yeah, so there's an in-audience sort of in-house gimmicks that sort of happen in quite a few of his films, including this House on a Haunted Hill that we're about to talk about. The Tingler was also infamous as well.
Yeah.
It's like a precursor to the Grand Guignol theaters as well.
Hmm.
Like when you talk about when there was the Grand Guignol like backdrop in Mad Love, if you could see like when we saw like that production, there was like an actual sort of like fake nurse in the audience in the scene with the scene in there, and that's definitely like something that William Castle definitely used and other people used for certain screenings as well. So yeah, he had that whole background as well. His biography, his autobiography is a little what they call apocryphal as far as whether it's, entirely true necessarily, or maybe that's not the point. But also, he also was a very influential producer and produced a very
Mm.
particular classic film that we'll be talking about later on as well.
Nice, nice. I like the continuity. It's 100 episodes. It's not 100 episodes, 25 episodes. We're telling 100 movie story here, and I like
Hmm.
to keep that in mind. That's a cool thing. I couldn't help but notice that supposedly this movie might have influenced Psycho at least a little, or maybe got Hitchcock to want to make a movie like because it was popular with teens. Clearly, teens were going to things like this. And I can't
Exactly.
help but wonder if like there was a slight like it was only in 1961 that Walt Disney, started promoting that there would be a Haunted Mansion ride. It would begin in 1963. I can't help but wonder if this had something to do with that. Maybe
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing as
but we
well.
have to,
So
we also have to talk like you were, I mean, to me, you alluded to it, the promotional gimmick, the emergo or whatever. Let's get
yes.
to that. I think I know, I was trying to find out exactly when that happened for audiences, and let me try to do it in the plot summary, even though I'm not 100% sure, although I think I'm right.
I
Yes,
think you probably are too.
the haunted house was a known thing of the world by the time of this movie, for sure.
Mm.
It's not like people had never heard of it, but this movie was obviously playing upon that, like a later screwball comedy plays on the conventions of the genre, but also,
Right. And also being an American haunted house as well, too. This being a
yeah,
very American film, which
yes,
giving a haunted house that kind of like an actual history as well, which is
yep,
unusual for such a still relatively young country.
yep. Great point. That is a great point that we're seizing on that, especially with this very modern Frank Lloyd Wright thing, which is now
Yeah, exactly.
purpose is haunted. Yeah, I know, isn't that crazy? Yes, so this movie obviously is okay, here's all the cliches of the genre, but and we're going to use them, but also we're going to do some things with them that you're not even quite expecting. So there's that. I don't think there were as many vats of acid in the old haunted houses of I don't know of Britain. But anyway, I think America we're better with vats of acid. I just vibe that we are. Maybe I'm wrong. Okay, it seems like I may as well jump into the plot, right? Jump into
Mhm.
the house. Yeah. Okay. So House on Haunted Hill begins with a scream and spooky noises in darkness. You almost get the vibe that like America's already listening to the Monster Mash. Like we know these noises and these things. They start you off with that, and then they bring you two floating heads, one after another, that tell us about the house, the party, and the offer of $10,000 for anyone who can spend a night there. The second head, which belongs to Frederick Lauren, voiceover introduces us to each of five guests arriving in funeral cars to the Ennis house that we just mentioned. The five guests, Lance, Ruth, David, Nora, and the homeowner Watson, establish that they don't know each other in the parlor and that they have barely or not met their host. Lance sees the entrance door is now a solid steel block and grabs Nora just before a chandelier falls on her. In a bedroom, Frederick tries and fails to convince the occasionally spouse-acidal fourth wife, Annabelle, to join the party. In the parlor, Frederick joins the party, pours drinks, explains them all being locked in until 8 a.m., and discusses ghosts with one of them, the homeowner, Watson, who claims four men and three women were killed there, each in a different room and in an outlandish way. Blood drips from a ceiling onto the gossip columnist Ruth, causing Watson to say the ghosts have marked her. In a wine cellar, Watson reveals a trapdoor full of toxic acid that has most of them heading back upstairs, except Lance and Nora, who remain in the wine cellar comparing notes until Lance enters a hall door that locks behind him. Nora bangs on the door, shouts, sees an odd woman who may be a ghost, runs upstairs, notifies the party, brings them back down, and readies to break down the door, but Frederick simply opens it, lights a candle, and gathers and wakes Lance. Watson tells Ruth they hit him. Back in the parlor, Dr. David debunks ghost stories, even as Watson says ghosts are becoming more active. No, clearly Watson is the ghost believer, whereas Frederick is the skeptic, which is interesting, or at least it's not what you would expect. It keeps it more interesting.
Mhm.
Nora returns to the hall with Lance, separates from him, knocks on walls, comes very close to an apparent evil gesturing ghoul, screams, and summons Lance, who asks why he didn't see this ghost float away. Alone again, Nora meets Annabelle, who graciously brings Nora to her guest room, grills her, warns her, goes to the hall, meets Lance, shows him to his room, tells him of the unexplained nature of the three previous Mrs. Lawrence, asks him for help, warns him, returns speedily to her bedroom, and brushes her hair while she banters with a returning Frederick about wanting each other dead. Nora opens a trunk in her room, finds a severed head, runs to the hall, and gets seized by a maybe ghost man who says she should join them before it's too late. In the parlor, Nora begs to leave just before Frederick, or I'm sorry, that's more like the living room. But Nora begs to leave just before Frederick introduces the two apparent ghosts as house caretakers just before they leave, locking everyone there until 8. Although Frederick opens toaster-sized coffin boxes, each with a gun. One pass to each guest. That's so fun. I would have loved to have been in the props department building those things. Nora brings everyone to her room to show the severed head that has now disappeared, Kieran, prompting Nora to shout and chase the other guests out into the hall. Lance asks Ruth to watch out for Nora, goes to his room, finds the severed head in his closet, brings it downstairs, gets threatened by Watson, goes to the hall upstairs, finds David finding Mrs. Lauren dangling by apparent suicide, and discovers Nora in her room, claiming that Mr. Lauren tried to kill her. In the bedroom, Frederick stares at his wife's corpse, gets interrupted, strangles Watson, and tells him to get out. In the parlor or in the living room amongst the guests, minus Nora, Dr. David reviews the near death experiences, accuses Frederick of murdering his own wife, and agrees with Lance that they should all sit in their separate rooms until 8 a.m. As Lance looks for a way out, he opens a trick door in the hall that slams shut behind him. Through a barred window, a snake-like rope enters Nora's room and coils around her ankles as Mrs. Lauren appears hanging outside. And by the way, Kieran, I'd love you to explain to me what the hell happened in that scene with the rope. Cora
Not
and
promising anything.
yeah, really, how could you? Nora enters the hallway, walks down it, sees Mrs. Lawrence strung up, and runs downstairs. David knocks on Frederick's door, asks about noises, and convinces Frederick to go check the cellar. David enters the bedroom and exposition dumps with the living Annabelle their plot to spook Nora enough to kill Frederick. They kiss with passion, Kieran. In the wine cellar, a frightened Nora does indeed shoot an entering Frederick, only to run away, leaving David to appear and drag Frederick's body toward the acid bath. But lights go out just before we hear yelps of horror. Annabelle comes to the cellar only to see a skeleton rise out of the acid bath and threaten her in Frederick's voice, enough that she trips and falls into the acid bath. We soon see Frederick using an elaborate stage puppet mechanism to work the off-screen skeleton in this shot that apparently in some theaters probably emerged from the ceiling at this time, a real skeleton. And when I say real skeleton, this isn't something that a medical student would have been using, but like a real prop skeleton, which probably scared the crap out of some theater goers. As you've got Vincent Price going, ooh, ooh,
And with some of those particular shots, they could also, in some, I would say also, they could have also released this in 3D in some way for
yes,
some of those
maybe,
particular
but it
shots.
wasn't, I don't think was it filmed in 3D?
No, it wasn't,
Oh,
but
okay.
it seems like, when they were with those particular shots, it reminds me of something that, a particular sort of 3D scene, let's just say.
Oh, I see. Okay. Is that, by the way, is that when you heard the emergo happen when he was working the skeleton
I
mechanism?
believe it was that. I don't think Because I think before, the only other spot where they could have done it possibly would have been the actual reveal of the skeleton the first
You're
time
talking about coming up from
that
the
spooks
acid
her. Yeah,
bath,
that coming up from there.
but I
But I
think
think
that wouldn't
they
have
might
been
have
as
wanted to not pull focus away from that.
exactly that. I don't think that would have been a good time to do. No, I think that time and the fact that the skeleton's not on screen when Vincent Price, Frederick, is there with the mechanism. I think that's perfect because he's kind of
Yes,
doing
agreed.
it and he's looking up a little bit, and it's like you can just picture if the theater owner knew what they were doing or the usher, that's a great moment. Like you get everybody freaking out. That's so good.
Exactly.
Lance, I'm sure if that did happen, I'm sure audiences were probably laughing over the thing I'm about to say, which is the last minute of the movie. Lance gets out of the trick wall to be comforted by Ruth, Nora, and Walton until the emergence of Frederick, who explains that he put blanks in Nora's gun and that David and Annabelle tried to kill him but have died instead. Frederick looks forward to a court proving his guilt or innocence from outside. A door of the house swings shut, as the title says, the end. Okay, Kieran, give us your thoughts on House on Haunted Hill.
Uh, it's just a generally fun film. It's a particular, this may or may not be, I'm trying to remember in the sort of timeline of Vincent Price, a particular Vincent Price role of the sort of, let's just say, deceitful partner, essentially.
Yeah,
So this might be like one of the first sort of more famous sort of instances of that. And I think he's pretty excellent in general.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Um,
Yep. You
I think,
absolutely believe him as like as somebody who would be like, "Oh, darling, I'd like to kill you. Oh, and honey, I'd like to kill you." That part, all that's working.
yeah, they have a wonderful chemistry because of that, I think.
Yeah,
So
like that love-hate chemistry, mostly hate.
yeah,
It's great.
mostly hate. But yes, the plot itself, I do enjoy the particular misdirect of the plot.
Yeah.
Elisha Cook Jr. always looks a little bit like Mickey Rooney to me for some reason, and I don't know
I get
why.
that. No, you know what?
So
You ain't wrong. I see that.
yeah, but it's all he's always just a wonderful sort of character as well. He's also a sort of red herring character as well, and being somebody who, in theory, should be someone exposing or guiding everybody to see what the actual true ghosts are, and the true ghosts never ever show up in this movie.
You reminded me more of Radar from MASH, like
Oh yeah, that makes more sense as well too.
but no,
Yeah.
no, but you're right when you say Mickey Rooney. Yeah, and you're right. Where are these ghosts? I mean, that, in a way, that's nicer than what happened in Night of the Demon or whatever. But on the other hand, how did was that rope being controlled by strings? I mean,
I don't really know. They explained it away as sort of basically saying you were the when the two star-crossed lovers, let's not call them that maybe, but they
sure.
meet essentially and say
Yeah.
this was wonderful, what you did was wonderful, how you this whole trick worked essentially is it's basically a longer sort of version of Diabolique again, where two people are basically trying to turn somebody else crazy essentially
Sure.
to do something to actually not kill, but not to die, but to commit murder in this case.
Sure, that's a
So
smart move. Yeah, no, I totally get that. Yeah, and they're trying, but I guess, yeah, so maybe they had strings that were manipulating the rope around, although that's a hard thing to do. Even a magician would tell you that's hard to get it all the way around her ankles like that. But anyway, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
well, yeah, I was wondering also as far as I don't know if I think all three characters that were playing against each other, I think all knew the machinations and mechanics of the
Right.
house more than they led each other on to believe, essentially. And
Sure.
I think what I was thinking was that in the beginning, when Nora is basically being spooked by what's going on in the cellar with lights and doors and everything else, I think what's going on there is that the doctor and his mistress in this case are the ones pulling the strings in this case. And then Vincent Price is
Things,
watching them
Kieran.
essentially during this
Right.
whole time. Because, there's a few different things where she thinks that she's getting strangled by somebody, that she thinks it's Vincent Price. And it's pretty sure that it's pretty certain, especially once you see how the plot resolves itself. And there's like the one scene where she goes out of the stairs. There's that and she's behind, just in front of the door. Behind the door, there's this fake sort of gorilla hand that comes out and tries to strangle her as well. That's obviously the doctor as well. So
Again, this reminds me of Curse of the Demon with that hand. Yeah.
exactly. Only it's much campier in this case
Sure.
than what it was before. But yeah, so it seems like so it's interesting to see how basically one group thinks that they have the house wired and everything else according to the plot that they want to lay bare, essentially. And then somebody else, of course, Vincent Price, because he's generally a sort of a high status person anyway, just in life, and his characters are generally sort of high status anyway. Vincent Price sees all of this ultimately and is the one basically ultimately being the puppet master slash skeleton master at the end of the movie.
Sure. I think you made such a good point just now about how that the way I read what you just said a minute ago, and is that like you have at least three characters who are each playing like kind of a major secret, and you want characters to have a secret. And I think where the and conflicting secrets, we don't know what they know about the house, and they don't know necessarily what each other knows as far as maybe like which secret passage might be where or what. And so it's like that you have these three characters each with that, and then you also have the two kind of young lovers or whatever we want to call them, Lance and Nora. I mean,
Exactly.
but and that's five pretty good like meaty roles, which is good because what happens when you go into these Agatha Christie things or Clue or whatever is maybe you only get three characters you really care about and the others fade into they're one note. And this doesn't feel you got five good notes here. I think Lance and Nora, and even Nora gets to kill Vincent Price. She's the only everybody gets past a gun. She's the only I'm not I don't know that they had to convince the actor. I don't know that the negotiations were long and drawn out to get the actress to take this role. But if I were a young actress, that would make and they told me everybody's going to get a gun. You're going to be the only one who and you're going to kill Vincent Price, at least apparently. That would be I'd be like, you know what? This I can scream through a film for that. That sounds pretty good. And Lance he's a test pilot. He's cool. He's the kind of you need that alpha male or what. I wonder if the screener is like, I'm tired of having an alpha male. Lock him in a wall for Act 3. But I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, but I'm just saying, I think it works a lot better than other this kind of thing. If you haven't seen 10 other movies like it, it's better than it's probably better than 8 of them. This stuff is harder to get right than it might appear where you
Right. Agreed.
and that it's going to work to something efficient and fun by the end.
Yeah, and they get away with a certain amount of just everything involving when we talk about the 50s creeping into the 60s in terms of trying to push the envelope of
Sure.
scenes of horror, just actually having that particular severed head show up at a few different points in the
Yeah.
film as
Oh,
well.
yeah. They couldn't have
There's
done that 5 years, 10 years before. Definitely not.
no,
Maybe.
definitely not.
Yeah, no, you're right. Absolutely.
And then there is, yeah, I was always wondering, are they just telling us basically that blind people float? Is that what the film is telling us?
I know because she does float, so that's pretty much as implausible as the rope. I don't.
It's floating, but actually, the way I look at it, it's just basically she's on a pulley. She's gliding across the room a few different times.
I think
So
ultimately you could explain all our little discrepancies by just saying that Nora had a subjective, was like looking through screamo-vision and not really understanding what she was seeing. You could get away with it by saying that this was just Nora having freaking, but that what really happened was not quite what she thinks she saw. I guess you could say that if you had to.
she's already been put on edge basically once the chandelier comes down.
From
So
then
everything
on,
else.
maybe little shards fell into her eyes so she couldn't tell when somebody's not floating or not. I don't know. That might
That's
make more
that's
sense.
that's a better theory than anything I would have had.
But
So
you're right with the hysteria. Like David Trent is like a hysteria expert. Okay, we knew that would be a man. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, we could have seen him basically having the same sort of role in Hexen so many years
Right.
earlier as well too.
But you're definitely right about Diabolique. When the two lovers get into each other's arms, it's absolutely
Mm.
is like Diabolique, Diabolique. And I wondered if that had been an influence on the script already, if they'd seen it or whatever. Maybe not. It didn't
I
have to
wouldn't be
be.
surprised if they were. I think that
Right.
particular film was pretty popular even in the
It
US. Maybe not the
was.
most popular, but yeah.
Right. And this was a relatively original script, right? You mentioned the first two movies were based on book or short stories, but not this one, right? This one.
That's correct, yeah. And Hitchcock was definitely public about him exclaiming the virtues of Diabolique, and I think Castle would have definitely noticed, I would think.
Sure.
So,
And this movie, Hitchcock would never have made House on Haunted Hill. It's just too low rent for
no,
him. But it does follow the Hitchcock thing of, is this supernatural? And then at the end, no, it's not,
no.
which is what we assume. I don't remember if Hitchcock ever had an acid bath. I'm going to say no. I'm going to say nobody ever, you never saw a big vat of acid. I think that would be, again, a little below his standards. But
Correct, yeah.
yeah, but yeah, no, no, I'm very happy I saw House on Haunted Hill. I think it's very fun.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
would say it's not, maybe not my favorite William Castle film
Okay.
necessarily. There's actually a later film that he directed with Joan Crawford that I like a lot called Straight Jacket.
Oh, I haven't seen that.
And
All
oh,
right.
that's yeah, I recommend that quite a bit
Okay.
actually.
Good to know.
It's another sort of is this person who is already institutionalized coming home, are they still crazy
Are
essentially?
they or aren't they, Kieran?
Yeah, and it's also yeah, really well done, and it's also post a particular film that we're going to talk about later. This film, Straight Jacket, comes after that. It's interesting to see the film in that context also.
Yep. Very good. Anything else about House on Haunted Hill that you know?
No, it's oddly enough, I saw the remake before I saw this
Okay. I've
original
never
one.
seen the remake. How is that?
It's a late 90s horror film. It has a very strong cast, like a really strong cast, actually, and some
Sweet.
things work better than others. It's one of those weird things where like, I think this happens just with the history of whatever decade you're in and you're seeing a film, depending on what's going on with you at the time, films like either become overrated, underrated again, problematic, less
Right.
problematic, maybe
Sure.
not so problematic compared to other things. So this is right now, I would say that remake has some problematic stuff still in it as well, but who
Okay.
knows, maybe 10 years from now, people will call it a masterpiece compared to whatever they're seeing at the currently. So
Right.
that could always change.
It seems as we ride through these, we often get either it's a new monster that we hadn't
Hmm.
really seen before, like in Curse of the Demon or The Fly, or in this case, it's just like the genre kind of being redone or retwisted or refashioned, but like either perfected or in the case of a haunted house thing, that seems like a thing we keep seeing. Another thing, I know that we're in the 50s and it's teenager time. We are getting, this is like the first time Hollywood's even aware of like separate demographics. So they hadn't, like in the 40s, they didn't say, oh, let's try to get this demographic, but not this other one. Now they're like, oh, okay, we can, it doesn't matter if old people never see these horror movies. We'll just make sure the teens see them. And so that's happening in a subtle way. I think that we're getting a House on Haunted Hill is just going to be fun. And then there's even more of that in the next film that we're going to see. It's for that drive-in crowd. It's for the American graffiti people. They would have been wanting to see something like this, that generation. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah. They knew based on Jimmy Dean or whatever that that was definitely an audience that they could try for.
exactly.
Yeah, and I don't know. It works. That's the thing. I'm sure there were like people like my mom, they might have been like too snobby to see something like this. I mean, she would have been like 21 when this came out, and I don't even
Hmm.
think she would have gone because she would have been like she would have gone to some Francois Truffaut film or something instead. But there were other 21-year-olds who would have been like, "Yeah, let's go see House on Haunted Hill." And I'm sure it's funny, even though the skeleton gimmick with the Emergo, even though that doesn't it's not 10 other movies did that, and yet still somehow the fact that they did it at all expands the possibilities for cinema for everybody. Okay, we could do that. We could just have a movie where they or the people pop up. I don't know. Yeah.
And it's also just part of a more immersive experience too.
Yeah,
Just
it
the
is
act
a little
of
immersive.
being a more sort of communal experience of going to a film and also having a show in a way that's
Yeah.
also a part of the film as well too. So
By the way, I wasn't surprised to learn that Ruth Bridgers, the actress, is Robert Mitchum's brother. I swear they
yeah,
like
they were dead.
look
Yeah,
a lot alike. No offense.
exactly.
I'm sorry. For all we know, that it's beautiful, but I'm just saying, I don't know. I'm like, oh my God, is that Robert Mitchum and wearing a wig? No. Okay. Anyway, moving on. That was the scary reveal. Okay. I guess we can move on to should I go on to our
Oh, certainly.
door number four,
Yeah.
uh, as we say in these haunted houses. One thing I'll say about Bucket of Blood, I don't know about that title. This is actually when
It
we
is, it did, there is a bucket of blood that very prominently in the film.
Oh,
And
really? Where is
it's
that? Okay.
basically when a certain character gets waylaid or hidden when a landlady comes in, essentially, after they
Okay.
just get killed. And
Okay.
there's the dripping that
I saw
happens.
that, but I didn't, I guess I
It all
missed
drips into a
it.
bucket. There's that
There
very
was a
loud
bucket like in his kitchen or something that he'd left
back,
out.
yeah, back where above where the hand,
Oh,
falls
okay.
down there. Yeah.
Because the thing is, you see that title and you're like, yeah, and then you don't really get it. But I also feel like that title could never have been in a movie, like in a family newspaper ad 5 years before. Bucket of blood. This is a definite sign that the Hays Code is breaking down. Bucket of blood. That's great. No,
And
yeah,
exactly. And also the film that it was double billed with mostly as well. Do you know what that one was called?
no. Oh, I
A,
saw it, but I forgot. Go ahead.
Attack of the Giant Leeches.
Oh, nice. Yeah, sure. That you can have Attack of the Giant, but this much blood. That's the thing is, remember, we only just had that blood in the Curse of Frankenstein. We're not really, that was more than anything ever in a color film.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's only 2 years later, So we're primed for some major thing. Other than that, I really like this film. I think that it's just you don't overpromise and underdeliver. I think that's my only little quibble. But
Yeah, there's some other talks. I think we'll talk about what they would have liked to have done budget-wise,
apparently
possibly.
that's that like Dick Miller complained, and it was a 5 day shoot. You know what? For a 5 day shoot, this thing looks amazing. And I'm not just saying that. This is a terrific film I suspect that Roger Corman was probably under contract to make sure it was an hour so that they could release it in certain places and barely, but good
And
enough.
also be part of a double bill as well,
Sure.
too.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Right. So 5 day shoot, really, they got a lot of impressive shots. They really did. To get this done in 5 days, I know that there wasn't much. No, it's well lit enough. The shots are not dragged out. They're pretty well edited. I don't know. I'm impressed. The opening with the camera coming out, there's a lot of good stuff in here.
from what I understand, I may or may not happen to have a Blu-ray of this movie. And
You can neither confirm nor
I
deny.
can neither confirm or deny that I may have listened to the audio commentary for this particular movie, and a lot of stuff there that you'll probably be talking about also in your plot summary as well. A lot of extolling about the virtues of a lot of it's a very well cast film in
Yes.
general,
Yep.
right? And
Yep.
also a lot of the
No
similar
argument.
sort of people that were like, say, the cinematographer or the music. A lot of them were also focused on other Roger Corman films previously, and also possibly a Little Shop of Horrors movie that happened, maybe that was shot also in 2 days, if I remember correctly.
That's what we're told.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what we were told as well. So there's a lot of just overlap, like an interesting snapshot of what Roger Corman had been doing for the whole decade up until that point. He wanted to take a break from like the giant leeches sort of type of
Right.
monster movie and make
Yep.
something different as well. And that's really a testimony because of the particular script that he had. And that particular screenwriter is an unsung hero. He did
Yes.
this. He did a Little Shop of Horrors. Probably his best thing I could say was that he wrote Death Race 2000
There you go.
also.
See?
Yeah,
Yep.
so he was Charles P. Griffiths
Yeah.
was just aces in general. And he also spent essentially knew I think he knew more of the assignment. If you read, there are quite a few different books about Roger Corman, quite a lot of them,
Oh
including
yeah.
one by himself, which is an interesting book. But Beverly Gray also writes an interesting book as well about Roger Corman, where she also worked like so many different people. This is our first time really talking about how Roger Corman was like an influential sort of pipeline to so many different future directors,
Well,
actors, and
we
everything
haven't
right
formed it.
there.
This is it. This is our
This
first
is
forming.
basically it, right? So
We're at movie number 28 on the list. And that's okay because I don't know, the AFI doesn't get to Hitchcock until like Rear Window. Like the
that's
original
crazy.
AFI
Yeah.
100, the original AFI 100 has no Hitchcock films prior to 1954. So it's okay for us to not get to Roger Corman until 1959. And I do think I mean, am I wrong? It is a bit of a breakthrough for him because he's finally doing
Mhm.
a little more comedy. It's funny that I don't know how many of these Roger Corman books that you're talking about you've read, but I guess from Corman's perspective, he was breaking away from some of those films that he'd made and trying to do something funnier. But I don't think Bucket of Blood, it's not that it's not funny the way that like Scream is or certain other kinds of films, but it's just paced well, I think. It has a
Certain
sense of
characters
humor about
are that
itself.
kind of funny, I would argue, but yes.
Yeah, the supporting beatniks are
Yeah,
goofy. They're like a
they're pretty
chorus
hilarious,
of
actually. Yeah.
they are funny, actually. Yeah, they're not funny. No, but I'm saying if you come to this expecting, I don't know what, like Scrooged or some other horror comedy or something, you're going to be a little bit disappointed. It's not the
Mm.
comedy really, but it is paced like one. And I think what really helps it is Dick Miller's performance. And you're right that the casting is great. He's such a kind of a schlemiel. He reminds me of Marty, the from 1956's or 55's Best Picture winner,
Mm.
Marty, in terms of an absolute kind of schlub who just, and I don't know, but he's perfect at that. I bet he could probably, he's such a strong actor. I bet he could also play the test pilot role in House on Haunted Hill if he wanted to. But in this movie, he's convincing utterly as some guy who's like, yeah, I make the clay when I come home. I don't know. I just do it. I work quick when I want. It works. You're transported into this.
Yeah, in terms of comedy, also from what Charles B. Griffith, his family, actually his grandmother specifically is in this film. Actually, the
Oh, I didn't
landlady
know
in the
that.
movie is her. Yeah, she was a vaudeville.
Oh, that's
He
cool.
came from a
Great.
line of sort of vaudeville performers. She had a radio show with her and her daughter, who was also, I believe, Charles B. Griffith's mother as well. And she actually died young, the daughter did as well, like it was like a very popular radio show in the 30s as well. So he had that particular background. And I think from what the interviews I was reading about with Charles P. Griffith, he was saying that Roger wasn't necessarily sure necessarily how to make a comedy per se. I think he knew how he wanted to do one, but wasn't necessarily sure about it. And Charles basically told him, don't have the actors play it like it is a comedy.
Right.
Have it
Play
be like
straight.
really
And
serious,
that
right?
was
So
great advice. Yeah. So
exactly.
nobody should think that this is Corman's first film. He'd done other things, but this was definitely a breakthrough. I think that we're
Hmm.
agreed about that. It helped him with future. And we're dancing around. We just had two Vincent Price films. Now we're in Roger Corman. Probably some people are like, wait, when do they get together? We're getting there.
We are getting there, yeah.
Give it another episode or so. Okay, I feel like with time, I should probably summarize this bad boy and we should
We can
start.
do that. The one thing I'll say is that
Go
the
ahead.
studios that they shot in also had this whole history. It was I think at that point, what were the studios called? I think they were called the Kling Studios at
Okay,
that point.
right.
And before that, like way back when they were actually Charlie Chaplin's
Oh,
studios
wow,
also,
wow.
like The Kid and some other ones, other films were made there.
Oh my
And
God.
then afterwards, it
Yeah.
had a it went through, I think, kind of Barbera. We used it at some point as well.
You
I
know,
think
when
most
you,
current. I
yeah,
think
go
most
ahead.
currently, I think it's being run by, it's like a Jim Henson Studios lot
Wow,
officially
wow.
right
Oh,
now.
but that place is going through a transition right now
It's
too.
going through a transition right now anyway. But
Yeah.
yeah, so
Wow.
that particular area, and most
Wow,
everything
that's
is
something.
filmed on that lot as well, with a few sort of like exteriors that
Yeah.
happened in the movie that,
I assume that was the night chase scene they had to
the
film.
night chase scene. Although the night chase scene actually, the exteriors of the apartments possibly as well is
Right.
where,
Okay.
but even like through the lumber yard, that's basically like the lumber yard essentially in the
Okay.
studios. But yeah, the good use of the studio itself, I would say.
Is House on Haunted Hill the only one of today's four films that doesn't have a cat in it, of like a prominent cat? I think the other three all
You're
have
right. Yeah, I
cats
think you're
in
right.
happening.
Yes.
Yeah. Some
Yeah.
cat. In Curse of the Demon, a cat changes into a jaguar. Don't ask me how. In The Fly, there's a cat that is teleported, and I don't know, its atoms are still lying
Oh,
around.
I forgot about that sort of thing with the fly story, going back to the actual original short story. The whole cat thing in the movie is muffed, I think, in my opinion.
Fly. Yeah,
What
they
happens
did.
in the
Yeah.
story when there's the whole scene where Andre tries to go back into the teleport
Okay.
after right
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
And when that happens, it actually gets worse for him. Like a bit of like the cat head ends up
Oh,
on his
wow.
fly head as well. So, which I don't think would have been maybe a bridge too far, like special effects wise for the Fly movie to
Sure.
maybe figure that out.
Yeah. Speaking of that, when the big reveal in the bucket of blood with a little bit of tuft of cat hair feels like a little bit of a low budget compromise. It would have been better to crack open the ceramic and just see a cat paw or something closer to what you eventually get revealed, but whatever.
Right. Agreed.
But that's fine. Yeah, it's funny. Maybe it's because it was the 50s, jazz was the hippest thing, and people were calling each other, "Hey, cat," because what's new, pussycat, or something. Because I don't know where all these cats are coming from. No dogs.
Yeah.
Okay, why don't we jump in here? Because time. Bucket of Blood begins on a close-up of a bearded bohemian, Maxwell Brock, blessing all that's best about art. As the camera pans out to show his accompanying saxophonist, was that guy a saxophonist? I think he was. This or was he?
Yeah, I can tell you about who he was also.
Oh, okay,
Or
good.
actually, no, not him. But well, okay.
Oh,
I'll mention him later.
you're getting to the guitar player, I bet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I figured. So we see this guy playing horn, we see the stage, and we see the larger club that Brock is browbeating, including a plain busboy, Walter, who wishes to be something of an artist. But as he shuffles away from a table, the now seated Brock abases Walter as pathetic. Somebody named Pops maybe talks secretly on a payphone about who is hustling and who might be hustled. Walter goes to his small drab home where he yells at his landlady, Mrs. Swickard, overboils some soup, flashes back on the words about art. They ring in his head. Tries and fails to make a nose from clay, yells at an unseen cat, Frankie, to stop meowing. It's almost like the cat teleported it from somewhere. Finally cuts into the wall to save Frankie and opens the wall to find that he stabbed Frankie to death. The cat got petrified in 2 seconds. The next rigor mortis set in quick. The next morning, outside the Yellow Door Club, Walter presents to Carla and Leonard a clay-covered cat figure stuck by a knife that he hopes he can sell. Inside the club, Maxwell Brock formally announces that the cat sculpture is the work of a true artist in the club. Oh, a true artist in a sterile century, Kieran. And the club goers crowd around Walter to congratulate him. Mr. DeSantis, the club owner, wants another cat and tells Walter to go home. But before Walter can, Neolia hits on him and, failing that, slips him a hit of heroin. I was trying to make a joke about hit and hit, but it didn't work. At home, Walter opens the door to a familiar club goer, Lou, who tries to arrest Walter for heroin possession, pulls out a gun, and receives a face full of Walter's defensive pan. Mrs. Swickard enters at the ruckus, but Walter manages to hustle her out before she sees Lou's dead hand poking out from where he hid the body in the ceiling. Kieran says there was a bucket of blood there. I
There
missed it.
was.
I believe you. At the club, Leonard knocks over the clay cat, which ruptures, showing hair, as we cut to a police car looking for Lou. Later, an obese man offers Leonard $500 for the clay cat, which he agrees to when he gets the cat back, for whenever Leonard gets the cat back. Leonard and Carla go to Walter's house to see his latest sculpture, which he calls Murdered Man, a man-sized man with bulging eyes and a crevice in his forehead. Acting strangely, Leonard pushes back on premiering the new sculpture, pays Walter $50 for the clay cat, and suggests Walter quit and sculpt an entire collection for viewing. The next day, Walter dresses in very hipster clothes, sits at the nice table at the Yellow Door, chats with the bohos, and sees the comely Alice, who calls him a busboy, gets corrected, volunteers to be his model, and asks him to sculpt something, but insults him when all he can do is press the clay into her hand and call it hand. Carla insults Alice and volunteers to be Walter's model, but he storms out. That night, Walter apologizes to Alice, convinces her to pose, receives her at his house, sits her in a rickety chair, corrects her that there is enough clay, and walks behind her and strangles her to death, Kieran. At Brock's house, Walter brings them his latest sculpture, a mostly nude Alice with a hand near her neck that Brock declares another masterpiece as Carla kisses Walter. That night at the Yellow Door, Brock publicly extols Walter, who wears a paper crown, drinks, and babbles, earning Leonard warning him to be careful what he says. At a wood shop or lumber yard, how they got there, I don't know. Walter worries how soon the public will forget him and suddenly assaults a woodworker, pushing his neck into a buzzsaw. Jeez. The next day outside the club, when Walter brings Leonard a new bust, Leonard says it's time to stop making art, and so they should have that full exhibition. Walking there at night in formal clothes, Walter proposes marriage to Carla, earning a rejection. So he proposes he sculpt her, earning an acceptance. At the smash successful art exhibition, Brock abandons his anti-materialism on Walter's behalf, while Carla opens up a statue, sees A human finger inside confronts Walter, understands what he wants, and runs. The other Bohemians, including the cop plants, get hip and chase Walter through the dark streets. Even as Walter chases Carla, gives up on her, runs home, almost knocks down Mrs. Swicker, sees his molding clay, and says, I'll hide where they'll never find me. The bohos and Carla run into Walter's apartment to see Walter dangling dead from a noose, as Brock says. He would have called it Hanging Man. The end. Okay. All right, Kieran, this is your favorite of the four. Please tell us a little bit about that. Why is that?
It's many reasons. I just, for some reason, there's a lot of things. Let's see. This is a particular period that I just think just gets underrepresented in horror in general.
Okay.
And a particular sort of like youth movement that also
Yeah.
gets underrepresented as well.
Yeah, I see
Um,
that.
I liken it to, I don't know, I was thinking like how Gen X feels about how boomers and
Yeah,
millennials fight over each other for supremacy or importance, essentially. And
I see
us, or
that.
we've been here this whole time. Look at what we've done as well. What we're doing is not
Sure.
too shabby.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of that. Maybe that's why I have an affinity as well. The For some reason, the sort of humor reminds me of something that maybe could have been penned by some sort of. This film was already seems to me like a Mad Magazine satire of a like an already famous movie as well.
Yeah.
It's
That
like a
makes,
similar humor as well
yeah,
too.
I see
Like it
that.
could have been called a bucket of bleh. So
Oh my God, that's hilarious.
yeah, there's a lot of just interesting stuff about just the actual, it's interesting to see, we're always interested to see like a worm who turns essentially. And when they turn to a certain point, do we still have sympathy for them or do we not as well? Because
Yeah.
basically Walter Paisley goes essentially from just a regular, just nobody, like basically a schlemiel until an artist and an accidental artist, and then he just becomes a serial killer. So
Yeah.
there's really no,
As you do.
as you do essentially. Um, there's a lot of interesting things a lot of the things that I've been thinking about were also touched upon as well. The person who did the commentary for this particular movie that I have, he also made a particular documentary about Dick Miller as well. That's also a very interesting one as well, too. His name is Elijah Drenner, and he's made some very salient points that I had been thinking about as well. You could also, one of the things you could say about this whole milieu that you're in when you're watching this movie is that you could consider this particular scenario or the setting being a whole metaphor for the movie industry in general. You could say that the
Mm-hmm.
Yellow Door is basically like this movie set. You could say, you could see Leonard being the producer of the movie, Maxwell being the director,
Okay. Yeah.
and then Barbara being, say, the female ingenue, essentially, and then Walter being this essentially this background extra, essentially, who aspires to be like the male lead. He would like to at least be
Yeah.
that, essentially. So there, one of the things that's interesting as well is that it talks about just the fallacy of wanting to be an artist without doing the work that it takes to be an
Yeah.
artist also, which is interesting as
Yeah.
well. Like this, he's looking for shortcuts essentially. He
Yeah.
accidentally runs into a shortcut essentially,
Sure.
and really he doesn't necessarily think you can't really tell, especially in the beginning, whether he really wants to be an artist or whether he wants to be just in the social scene of what he sees all these other artists are part of in his
Yeah.
life as well. And I think
Right.
it seems like he's more interested in hopping into that sort of social scene without actually being an artist
Right.
itself.
If you could just stop making if he could just hang out and be loved by all those guys without making art, he probably would. Right. That's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the rejections that happen in his life or that happen throughout this film are all because he's doing something he's not equipped to do, essentially. And he's very impatient. He wants to like create like a bust of Barbara's face at some point, essentially right after he does the cat, essentially, and then he basically tries to do that, and he's saying, "Why aren't you mold clay, mold thyself into Barbara's head?" And that doesn't work out that way, right? So yeah, things like that, and just realizing there's an interesting sort of he's not really aware. I mean, there's a lot of, let's just say, contemporary sort of incel characteristics going on with him, especially what happens with him and Barbara as well, when Barbara tries
Yeah.
to gently talk about it's I'm loving the art that you make. It doesn't mean that
You
I
mean
want to
You're saying Carla because
Carla,
you're
excuse
saying
me. Well,
Barbara.
Barbara, I think is the
Barbara is
actress.
the name of
Sorry.
the
Sorry.
actress. Yeah. So
Yeah.
when Carla tries to let him down easy, yes, I did kiss you, but that was because I was reacting to the art. Yeah.
Yeah, I was reacting to the art as well. And I don't know if this is just a 50s thing where all of a sudden everybody just, their one particular gesture or some particular event means that you're destined to be together forever and let's just get married. I don't know if that's just how things were in the 50s or if this is just, or if they're commenting on how even this is just a little bit too unrealistic, let's just say as well.
Yeah. It's great that they're in the beatnik culture at kind
Yes.
of a time when it was a thing. It wasn't like it wasn't a thing. And they were smart enough to make fun of it or like love it, but also look at it from a, like you said, like a Mad Magazine perspective anyway. Especially with, like you said, those supporting characters, including the cops. There's this weird, oh, the cops, and they're on the phone trying to bust them. I love that the cops are just ever present because they don't really need to be in the movie, but it's so funny that they are. Like that's part of it. That's hilarious. There's a
Right.
lot.
It's part of another film that would have happened, or they would have been busting these same juvenile delinquents in another sort of, probably other sort of series of juvenile delinquent films that were happening in the 50s anyway. A lot of undercover stings happening as well, if I imagine. So,
Just you didn't happen to see the new movie, A Complete Unknown,
no, I still haven't
with
seen that
Timothée
yet. How is that?
Chalamet as Bob Dylan. It's fine, but this is you when you see that and you also see Bucket of Blood, you're like, why couldn't the Bob Dylan movie have been more like this? Because it at least is so there's a way in which it present the Bob Dylan movie, this one, and there's been others, makes you take beatnik culture very seriously, makes
Hmm.
you think of Pete Seeger as like almost a gospel,
Yes.
and it's much easier. I don't know. I get everything you said about like Gen X, and you're not wrong. But I think we're at our best when we can also make fun of how we were. Something
Right.
like it's like the Nirvana video, but like done by Weird Al, like
Yes.
where we know, yeah, this is like we're into it, but also this is ridiculous, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say it's not like a perfect comparison because we're also I'm definitely feeling my age because I think 80s music, 80s, everything 80s is now at this point where we were when we were like teenagers thinking about the 50s,
Right.
essentially.
Yeah. Right. There's that. But it's different. This is right at the time of Andy Warhol art and the movie's making fun of that, like saying, okay, nothing art is terrible, but it's needed, but it's the only good thing. And now that nobody's got any good ideas anymore. So it's kind of like you're feeling the postmodern turn, but you're also like talking about how it's silly and we're going to have a person, if we're not careful, we're going to have a Walter Paisley telling us what's art or what. I just think it really I think you're right. This movie does work on a lot of levels, a lot of clever levels generally. I think, yes, I'm sure there was a few shots. I'm sure if Roger Corman were here, and he could have been here just a few years ago, he could,
Yes.
I wouldn't have minded reshooting maybe one or two shots here and there. It's fine. It's fine for what it is,
Yeah. Yeah. What did you do like with the 5 days they had to shoot it as
And
well?
$50,000. So I guess Dick Miller complained that the last shot should have been him in clay, but they didn't have time. Okay, sure. But it works anyway, because he wouldn't have had time to really throw clay all over himself.
And also, we also realized like throughout, he really doesn't really know. He's really, if he doesn't really
Yeah.
have inspiration necessarily as an
No,
artist
exactly.
necessarily.
Right.
He's lucking into, he's
Yeah.
basically his art is out of necessity to cover his tracks for his murderous deeds, basically. So it's not really done out of any sort of inspiration necessarily. It's because he's trying to affect a pose, let's just say. So it's one way of looking at it.
I think
Um,
all of these movies show what you can do with a lower budget. I guess increasingly lower as you get down, but I think that's probably good, and that probably made more teenagers run out to see them. Sorry, what were I was
oh
interrupting.
no, that's a good point. I was only going to talk about just the weird connection with this film and House of Wax.
Oh, there's clearly a connection. Yes, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Even more
Yeah,
randomly,
history of the Wax
so
Museum. Yeah.
there's the
Yeah.
Wax Museum as well. Oh, yes, there was that
Well,
particular movie
it's
that they
probably
were.
closer to that, the plot.
Yes, I believe they were talking about that there was a little more influence with that plot line, but
Sure. Yeah,
also
fair.
this is also the age when movies were also being sold to television as well, and not just television over in the US, but in other countries. So when House of Wax got sold to German television, the German title of House of Wax was called The Cabinet of Professor Bondi. Vincent Price's character was somehow
Nice.
Professor Bondi, but
Oh,
they were
wow.
also
That's
alluding to a
funny.
cabinet of Dr. Caligari, obviously,
That's
right?
funny.
So, and
Like,
then what they randomly did later, when I think it was in 62, they broadcasted Bucket of Blood over in German television. They they renamed the film The Legacy of Professor Bondi. And
oh,
there's this random
wow.
prologue. I got to see it in the Blu-ray that I was mentioning as well. Basically, there's this new prologue where there's this old decrepit Professor Bondi, obviously not played by Vincent Price, who's in this old Bavarian castle talking about how he's about to die. He talks to various mannequins. One of them looks like he could have been like a former lover of his, possibly. And he's talking about he wants his legacy of evil to be passed down to all of his heirs, to any of his heirs, if any of them were living. And apparently his only living heir turns out to be Walter Paisley. And it's very random. He basically tries to conjure up a spell to Walter. We don't know if he's successful in bestowing his evil magnificence upon Walter Paisley, but it intimates that that's what happens, and then the film starts that we see essentially. So there's this weird sort of prologue where they try to shoehorn House of Wax and have it be connected that literally with Bucket of Blood. And it's only happened in German television randomly. But it goes to show, especially with a lot of these older films, when and this happens a lot, especially with the films with these short run times. When they started to broadcast on television, there was this thing going on where they would definitely, depending on the length of them, they would have to either add some sort of other unrelated
Oh, I
scenes to
see.
the
Right.
films
Or have a narrator show
or
up.
shoot scenes later in order to add more things
Yeah.
because they had the particular block of time
Interesting.
to
Yeah.
broadcast those films. So
Were you going to say something about the Bandolero, if I can call him that, because he was
oh, I know
speaking Spanish?
I think he was a founding member of the Limelighters, if I remember correctly.
Wow. Nice. Okay. Cool.
And then the actual person who composed the music, who did the music for Little Shop of Horrors as well, he was part of a particular quartet. What was the name of that quartet as well?
Yeah. And by the way, in case people are listening to Kieran, the Little Shop of Horrors was like made the year after by the same director, Roger Corman. In case that's not.
Right. And a lot of those people all met, apparently, everyone that was part of that movie, a lot of them all met at Schwab's. We haven't really
Okay.
talked about Schwab's. I don't know if you've talked about Schwab's in other seasons as far as being like the sort of like drugstore that everybody went to get discovered in
I haven't
Hollywood.
been talking about that. See, this is good. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting. Everybody, yeah. But the composer of this film was part of something called the Chico Hamilton Quintet, and they like featured prominently in a particular film
Huh.
called The Sweet Smell of Success.
Oh, wow. Great film from the
So
same
yeah.
time. Fred Katz, it says.
Hmm.
Okay, we should wrap up with this. This is about, we're pushing the time here. Final thoughts about Bucket of Blood before we think of what we want to say about films.
Love it. There's a remake also. Back in the
Okay.
90s, Roger
They
Corman
made
was
him,
sort of
and
like
there's a
remaking some of those
musical.
films.
Yeah, that's like
It
crazy.
was actually a more like regular sort of like darkly comic sort
Okay.
of version that has Anthony Michael Hall in it, Justine
Oh,
Bateman,
fun.
a
Wow.
bunch of like young Will Ferrell. Like it's directed by the guy who's like not the Michael McDonald that we know of, but the Michael McDonald from Mad TV. That particular sort of he's a sketch comedy guy. You recognize him if you
Wow.
see him, basically. I didn't realize he also directed stuff, but yeah, it was interesting to see. This is like a '90s film that has a bunch of soon-to-be famous, like older or established former child stars
Wow.
turned adults, and also sort of
Did you
like
see it? Did you see that?
I saw it a long time ago. I didn't get to go to rewatch it to remember it, but yeah, and the cast list
There
is also like a
also
who's
was
who of
there also is a musical, like you knew that too, which is
yes.
yeah, just from 2 years ago or something, which is weird.
That is weird too. They're trying to create the sort of similar success that the Little Shop of Horrors musical had, I would
Well, I
imagine.
guess that's where they're going with this. Yeah, so let's do all of Roger Corman's 100 movies. So yeah, like we can, yeah, let's mine this thing territory even more. Let's
Exactly. I would love to see how
scrape this
Death Race
bucket.
2000 would be a musical.
Hell yeah, now we're talking. Now you're talking right there.
Yeah.
Okay, so what did we learn today of these four films? We learned that cats disappear, and maybe they should. I don't know. We learned that.
We just learned about the pitfalls of just wanting to be something while taking the shortcuts to be something, essentially.
Okay,
We learned
right.
about we saw like another sort of variation on a misdirect of who is haunting who, let's just say. And
Yes.
then we've also seen two differing viewpoints of what the scientific method should do. Should it, explore sort of new
Yes.
realms? That Vincent Price compares Andre to basically like Christopher Columbus, maybe not the best example these days of an explorer, but he basically called him an explorer essentially, and which in a noble sense for science essentially, whereas science is being used to tamp down and discredit or disprove things rather than discover new things or be open to new things in
Sure.
Curse of the Demon. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Said. Nice. Like, you definitely covered what we learned. And I think this is all happening in the context of the 50s. The Hays Code is next to dead. Movies like this are pushing, keep, also helping to make the Hays Code less of a thing. Or it's becoming, come on, let's not be silly anymore. Like these old rules about whatever they were, women with like a foot flat on the floor in the bedroom, if you have two people in bed. That's not in these movies, but I'm just saying how certain things are getting stupid, like the bad guys can never win. Those are just getting to be a little bit dumb now. And these movies, so you can just see that happening. And I think that's exciting.
yes, and the Hays Code will definitely be put to the test with the next films that we're talking
Oh, I
about.
love that. Yeah. One thing I noticed about next episode's films is, and this is the first time this is going to happen, and it might actually also be the last time this is going to happen, which is all four of them come from the one single year. And that
Hmm.
particular year is 1960. Probably best known to horror aficionados or to any film aficionados as the year of Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock. Absolutely a very important horror film that you should see, which would be like number one on a list of like 125 horror films ranked by importance or whatever. And that's fine. And it should be. But of course, it was already covered by the AFI. So next week, we are going to talk about Les Yeux Sans Visage or Visage, excuse me. I couldn't say Les Yeux Sans Visage. Yeah. Eyes Without a Face. Peeping Tom. Oh my God, that's a hell of a film. Jigoku, yes, thank you, Japan, and Black Sunday. Wow, we are going abroad for this thing, and I love
Hmm.
it. This is going to be fun, and you've already sent me links, which I'm going to need to Criterion, and those are great. I think we've done good work here. I'm impressed with us, and I love our deep dive next week into 1960. I'm already
Agreed.
anticipating that's going to be fun. We hope you'll join us. Would you agree with that, Kieran? You'd hope that as well?
I always hope that as well.
Okay,
Yes.
great. And until then, save us some popcorn because there will always be another movie to see.